Julian Vance stared through the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office, but he did not see the sprawling city below. He saw only numbers, cascading behind his eyes like a relentless digital waterfall. Market shares, quarterly projections, the ever-fluctuating stock price of Vance Industries. They were the cold, hard metrics by which he measured his existence, and lately, they were failing him. The pressure from the board was a physical weight on his shoulders, a constant, low-grade hum of disapproval that vibrated through the polished marble floors. His office was a monument to minimalist wealth. A single, sprawling desk of volcanic rock, 2 severe leather chairs for guests he rarely welcomed, and a stark, abstract painting that had cost more than the average house. It was a space designed to intimidate, to project power and control. But inside, Julian felt like a ghost haunting a museum of his own success. He was isolated, adrift in a sea of responsibility he had inherited but never truly wanted. A sharp chime from his desktop announced another encrypted email from Peterson, the most ambitious and least trustworthy member of his board. The subject line was simply, "Merger." Julian's jaw tightened. This merger was his father's final legacy, a corporate marriage that would create a global behemoth. It was also a deal built on a foundation of secrets he was only beginning to understand. He felt a familiar surge of resentment, a bitterness toward the man who had handed him a crown made of lead. He needed to escape. He shut down the monitor, the numbers vanishing into darkness. He grabbed his coat, a cashmere garment so finely woven it felt like smoke, and left without a word to his assistant. He needed air, even the city's smog-filled version of it. He needed to be somewhere that did not echo with the silent judgment of his father's portrait, which hung in the boardroom like a permanent accusation. He found himself walking aimlessly, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement, a sound that seemed alien and intrusive in the bustling afternoon. He ended up in a small city park, a patch of green struggling for life amidst the concrete and steel. It was a place he had never been before, a world away from the curated rooftop gardens and exclusive clubs he usually frequented. Here, the laughter was real, the benches were worn, and the pigeons were bold. He sat on a cold iron bench, watching children chase each other around a tired-looking fountain, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. He did not belong here. A small shadow fell over him. He looked down to see a little girl, no older than 6, with enormous brown eyes and a solemn expression. She wore a faded pink coat with a button missing, and she clutched a small, crumpled wad of bills in her tiny fist. She looked at him with an unnerving intensity, as if she were assessing his very soul. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the city's hum. She extended her hand, the money held out like a fragile offering. "Here's $50. Julian stared at the money, then back at her face. It was a collection of 1s and 5s, clearly saved with great care. He was confused, caught completely off guard by the surreal encounter. "What is this for?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The little girl took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Be my dad for a day," she said, the words a quiet plea that struck him with the force of a physical blow. "My mom says he's watching from the stars, but I need one for the father-daughter dance at the community center. Just for today." Julian Vance, the man who controlled a multi-billion-dollar empire, who could make or break companies with a single phone call, was rendered speechless. He looked at the crumpled bills, then into the desperate hope in the child's eyes. In that moment, the stock market, the merger, the entire cold, empty world he inhabited, simply ceased to exist. There was only this small girl and her impossible request. For a long moment, Julian could not form a response. The child's words echoed in the sterile silence of his mind. He looked from her earnest face to the crumpled bills she still held out to him. $50. To him, it was less than nothing, the cost of a forgotten appetizer. To her, he could see, it was a treasure, a sacrifice of immense proportions. He finally found his voice, though it felt like an unfamiliar instrument. I can't take your money," he said, the sentence feeling clumsy and inadequate. He was used to negotiations, to leverage and power plays, not the raw, unfiltered honesty of a child. The girl's face fell, a shadow of disappointment crossing her features. "Is it not enough?" she asked, her whisper laced with genuine worry. "I can try to get more. I have a piggy bank." A strange ache bloomed in Julian's chest, a feeling so foreign he could not immediately name it. It was a mix of sorrow and something else, something softer. "No, it's more than enough," he said quickly, trying to reassure her. "That's not the problem." Before he could explain further, a woman came rushing toward them, her face etched with panic. "Mia, there you are? You must not run off like that," she knelt, gathering the little girl into a fierce hug. When she looked up at Julian, her eyes were filled with a mixture of apology and suspicion. "I am so sorry," the woman said, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. She had a quiet dignity about her, a weariness in her eyes that spoke of long hours and endless worry, but also a core of unyielding strength. "I hope she wasn't bothering you." "She wasn't," Julian replied, his gaze shifting from the mother to the child, who was now hiding her face in her mother's coat. She made me an offer." The woman, Elena, followed his gaze to the money still clutched in her daughter's hand. Her expression softened with a pained understanding. "Oh, Mia," she sighed, stroking her daughter's hair. She looked back at Julian, a faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "The community center dance. I'm afraid she's been a little preoccupied with it." "She offered to hire me," Julian stated simply. The absurdity of the situation struck him again. Hired? For $50. He, who commanded a salary that could fund a small city, was being offered a day rate by a 6-year-old. Elena's eyes widened slightly, and she quickly took the money from her daughter's grasp. "Mia, we don't do that," she said gently but firmly. To Julian, she was all apology. "Please forgive her. We should be going." She stood, taking Mia's hand, ready to retreat back into their own world and leave him to his. But something stopped Julian from letting them walk away. It was the image of the girl's hopeful face, the quiet grace of the mother, the stark contrast of their reality against his own empty existence. "Wait," he said, the word more of a command than he intended. He softened his tone. "The dance. When is it?" Elena hesitated, her protective instincts warring with her politeness. "It's this evening," she said reluctantly. "But it doesn't matter. We weren't going." "Why not?" Julian pressed, driven by an impulse he did not understand. "Because," Elena said, her voice dropping, "it's for fathers and daughters. And as Mia mentioned, her father. He isn't here." The finality in her tone should have ended the conversation. It was a door, politely but firmly closed. Julian looked at Mia, who peeked out from behind her mother's leg. Her eyes were wide with a silent, desperate plea. The numbers, the merger, the boardroom battles, they all seemed like a foolish game compared to the profound disappointment in that small face. He made a decision then, one that defied all logic and every instinct for self-preservation he had cultivated over the years. "I'm not busy this evening," Julian said, the words feeling momentous as they left his lips. "I don't dance well, but I can stand there, if you'll have me." Elena stared at him, her expression a canvas of disbelief, suspicion, and a flicker of something else, perhaps a desperate hope she dared not acknowledge. She saw a man in a coat that cost more than her rent for a year, a man who radiated an aura of power and distance, offering to step into their humble life for a few hours. It made no sense. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her question direct and stripped of pretense. Julian met her gaze. He had no logical answer. He couldn't explain that he was suffocating in his own life, that the innocence of her daughter's request felt like the first real thing he had encountered in years. So he gave the only answer he had. "Because she asked," he said simply, "and because nobody has asked me for anything but my money in a very long time." The community center was a humble brick building, filled with the sounds of laughter and slightly off-key music. The air smelled of punch and cookies. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the crepe paper decorations, a stark contrast to the warm, genuine joy that filled the room. For Julian, it was like stepping onto a different planet. He stood awkwardly near the entrance, wearing a suit that felt ridiculously out of place. He had insisted on picking them up, arriving in a sleek black car that had caused Elena to flush with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Mia, however, had looked at it as if it were a magical carriage. She now stood beside him, clutching his hand tightly, her face glowing with an excitement that was almost painful to watch. She wore a simple blue dress, and Elena had tied a matching ribbon in her hair. Elena kept a careful distance, her posture radiating a reserved gratitude. She had agreed, against her better judgment, mostly because of the sheer, unadulterated hope in her daughter's eyes. But she watched Julian with a quiet, observant intensity, trying to understand the man behind the expensive suit. "You really don't have to do this," she murmured, for what felt like the 10th time. "We can leave whenever you want." "I'm fine," Julian said, and to his own surprise, he was. The initial discomfort was fading, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Here, he was not Julian Vance, CEO. He was just a man in a suit, a temporary stand-in. The anonymity was a relief. Mia tugged on his hand. "They're playing the slow song," she whispered, her eyes wide with nervous anticipation. "It's time." Julian looked out at the makeshift dance floor, where fathers were swaying awkwardly with their daughters, some holding them in their arms, others standing on their shoes. A lump formed in his throat. He had never done this. His own father had been a man of boardrooms and business trips, not school dances and slow songs. He looked down at Mia. "I told you, I'm not a very good dancer," he warned gently. "That's okay," she said with the infinite wisdom of a child. "You just have to stand and sway. Mom says that's what dads do." He let her lead him onto the floor. He placed his hands on her small waist, and she put her tiny hands on his shoulders. They began to sway, a clumsy, shuffling movement that was entirely out of sync with the music. Julian felt the eyes of other parents on them, looks of curiosity and confusion. He ignored them, focusing on the small, trusting weight of the child in his arms. For 3 minutes, the world shrank to the space they occupied. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart, a rhythm of pure, uncomplicated life. He looked over her head and met Elena's eyes. She was watching them from the side, a complex, unreadable expression on her face. It was not pity, nor was it simple gratitude. It was something deeper, a flicker of connection, a shared moment of profound, unexpected tenderness. When the song ended, Mia beamed up at him. "You did great," she declared, as if he had just executed a perfect waltz. Later, as they sat at a small table eating cookies, Mia fell asleep, her head resting on Julian's lap. He found himself stroking her hair, the simple, paternal gesture feeling both alien and deeply natural. Elena sat across from him, the silence between them no longer awkward, but comfortable. "Her father," Elena began, her voice soft. "He would have loved this. He was a wonderful dancer." She spoke of him in the past tense, but the love in her voice was present and alive. "What did he do?" Julian asked, his curiosity genuine. "He was a firefighter," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. He died saving people." Her gaze became distant, lost in a memory. "It was a warehouse fire. Vance Industries." The name hit Julian like a punch to the gut. Vance Industries. His company. His legacy. The blood drained from his face. He stared at Elena, the gentle, kind woman who had just unknowingly revealed a devastating connection between them. The merger, the secrets his father had buried, the whispers of a cover-up. It all came rushing back, now with a face and a name. He was sitting with the widow of a man his family's company may have been responsible for killing. He said nothing. He couldn't. The cookie turned to ash in his mouth. He looked down at the sleeping child in his lap, a child who had asked him to be her father for a day, and felt the crushing weight of a truth that could destroy this fragile, beautiful moment forever. The drive back to their small apartment building was silent and heavy. Julian's mind raced, replaying Elena's words. A warehouse fire. Vance Industries. The phrase was a death knell, a verdict delivered in a quiet, unassuming voice. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The merger negotiations had involved a deep dive into the company's history, and he recalled a sealed file, labeled Industrial Accident, Sector 7, from 3 years ago. His father, and his father's loyalists on the board, had dismissed it as a settled matter, a tragic but closed case. Now he saw it for what it was, a ghost that was currently asleep in the back of his car. When they arrived, he carried the sleeping Mia up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. The building was old, the hallways dimly lit, and smelling of cooked cabbage and disinfectant. It was a world away from the climate-controlled silence of his penthouse. Elena unlocked the door to a small, meticulously clean apartment. It was sparsely furnished, but every object, a framed photo on the wall, a stack of books on a small table, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, was placed with care and love. It was a home. He laid Mia gently on her bed, a small cot in an alcove off the living room. Elena pulled a worn, handmade quilt over her. For a moment, they stood together in the dim light, looking down at the sleeping child. The domesticity of the scene was so potent, so foreign to Julian, that it made his chest ache. Elena led him back to the small living room. "Can I offer you some tea?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. "It's the least I can do." He should have left. He should have made his excuses and fled back to the safety of his sterile, empty world. But he couldn't. He was tethered to this place now, by a truth he hadn't yet spoken and a connection he was terrified to break. He nodded. Yes, tea would be nice. As she moved around the tiny kitchen, her movements efficient and graceful, Julian took in the details of their life. He saw a pile of nursing textbooks on a chair. He noticed a crack in the window pane, neatly taped over. On the refrigerator, amidst Mia's colorful drawings, he saw a final notice for a utility bill. The evidence of their struggle was everywhere, yet there was no sense of despair in the apartment. There was only resilience. She handed him a steaming mug. It was chipped at the rim. He wrapped his hands around it, the warmth a small comfort against the chill inside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator. "Thank you again," Elena said, finally breaking the silence. "For tonight. You made my daughter happier than I have seen her in a very long time." "She's a wonderful girl," Julian said, the words feeling inadequate. "You've done an amazing job with her." A faint, sad smile touched Elena's lips. "We manage," she said. "It's not the life I planned for her." Her father, Marco, he had so many dreams for her. College, travel, a big house with a yard. Her gaze drifted to the taped window. "Not this. You said. The fire," Julian began, his voice strained. "You're certain it was a Vance Industries building?" Elena looked at him, her brow furrowed slightly at his tone. "Yes, I have the official report. They said it was faulty wiring, an accident. The company paid a settlement. It was enough to cover the funeral and not much else. Their lawyers said it was a generous offer, that we weren't entitled to anything." A flicker of old anger, long suppressed, flashed in her eyes. It never felt right. Marco was so careful. He always said the safety protocols at that place were a joke. Every word was a nail in Julian's coffin. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was telling the truth. The generous offer was hush money. The sealed file was a cover-up. And he, as the current CEO, was now the face of that lie. He felt a desperate urge to confess, to tell her everything right then and there. But how could he? How could he look at this woman, who had shown him nothing but quiet grace, and tell her that his family was responsible for destroying hers? How could he tell the little girl who had called him dad for a night that his name was the same one on the building where her real father had perished? He looked at his hands, wrapped around the cheap, chipped mug. They were the hands of a liar. He took a sip of the tea. It was just a simple, inexpensive brand, but it tasted more authentic than anything he had consumed in years. It was a taste of a life he knew nothing about, a life of integrity and quiet struggle, and he was about to poison it. "I have to go," he said abruptly, standing up. The confession died on his lips, replaced by the coward's instinct to flee. Elena looked surprised but nodded, her innate politeness taking over. She walked him to the door. Will Mia see you again?" she asked, a touch of vulnerability in her voice that she immediately tried to hide. Julian paused at the door, his back to her. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that he would come back, that he would fix everything. But he couldn't make a promise he knew he would have to break. "I don't know," he said, the words tasting like failure. He walked out of the apartment, leaving the warmth and the light behind, and descended back into the cold, familiar darkness of his own life. The next morning, Julian stormed into his office, bypassing his assistant and locking the door behind him. He went straight to the secure digital archives on his computer, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. He entered his highest-level clearance codes, overriding the locks his father's old guard had put in place. He found the file, Industrial Accident, Sector 7. He opened it. It was worse than he had imagined. It was not just negligence. It was a deliberate, calculated cover-up. Internal memos detailed complaints from workers about faulty wiring and a malfunctioning sprinkler system. Inspection reports had been falsified. The company had received a warning from the fire marshal's office months before the blaze, a warning that had been buried by a senior vice president, a man named Peterson. Peterson, the same man who was now leading the charge for the merger. The same man who had been his father's most ruthless lieutenant. The final report was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. It blamed a freak electrical surge, an act of God, absolving Vance Industries of all meaningful responsibility. And at the bottom, authorizing the small settlement payments to the victims' families, was his own father's signature. Julian felt sick. He leaned back in his chair, the sterile air of his office suddenly suffocating. This was the foundation upon which his empire was built. Not on innovation and hard work, but on lies, greed, and the lives of men like Marco. Men who had left behind women like Elena and children like Mia. He spent the next few days in a fugue state. He avoided Elena's calls, letting them go to voicemail, unable to listen to the hopeful tremor in her voice. Instead, he dug deeper, using his resources to quietly investigate. He hired a private investigator, a discreet man who specialized in corporate malfeasance. The truth that came back was ugly and undeniable. Peterson had not only orchestrated the cover-up, but had personally profited from it, using the insurance payout to fund a side project that had made him millions. The merger was his chance to bury the crime forever, to ascend to a position of untouchable power in the new conglomerate. Julian felt a pull, a magnetic draw back to the small apartment. He needed to see them, even if he couldn't speak the truth. He found himself driving to their neighborhood one afternoon, parking down the street. He just watched, feeling like a ghost. He saw Elena walking Mia home from school, their hands clasped together. He saw them stop to help an elderly neighbor carry her groceries up the stairs. Small acts of kindness, woven into the fabric of their lives. He went back to his empty penthouse and was struck by the cavernous silence. He walked through the rooms, touching the expensive, meaningless objects he had accumulated. He had everything, and he had nothing. Elena and Mia had nothing, and they had everything that mattered. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he drove to their building. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to see them. He bought a simple bouquet of daisies from a street vendor, a flower that seemed more fitting than the exotic orchids his florist usually provided. He knocked on their door, his heart pounding. When Elena opened it, her surprise was quickly followed by a warm, relieved smile. "You came back," she said softly. Mia heard his voice and came running from her room, a piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Julian," she cried, throwing her arms around his legs. "I made you something." She held up the paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, cheerful crayon. It showed 3 stick figures under a smiling sun. A tall man, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands. Underneath, in wobbly letters, she had written, "My new family." Julian stared at the drawing, the simple, powerful declaration of a child's heart. It broke him. The guilt he had been carrying, the lies he was keeping, it all came crashing down on him. He felt the sting of tears in his eyes, an emotion so long suppressed he had forgotten what it felt like. Elena saw the look on his face, the raw pain that he could no longer hide. Her smile faded, replaced by concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. "What's wrong?" He couldn't speak. He just shook his head, taking the drawing from Mia's hand and holding it as if it were the most precious object in the world. He had come here to find some measure of peace, but instead, he had found a deeper, more profound level of torment. He was holding the love of a child he was actively betraying with his silence. That night, he made a choice. The cowardice was gone, burned away by the simple honesty of a crayon drawing. He knew what he had to do. It would cost him everything. The company, the merger, his father's legacy. But it was the only way to become the man that Mia thought he was. It was the only way to be worthy of standing in the same room as Elena. The next day, Julian called an emergency meeting of the board. He walked into the cavernous boardroom, the long mahogany table gleaming under the recessed lighting. His father's portrait stared down at him, its painted eyes seeming to hold a new layer of judgment. The board members, all older men in dark suits, looked at him with a mixture of impatience and condescension. Peterson sat at the opposite end of the table, a smug, confident smile on his face. "Gentlemen," Julian began, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "I am canceling the merger negotiations." An uproar filled the room. Voices overlapped in protest. Peterson slammed his hand on the table. "You can't be serious, Vance. This deal is the culmination of your father's life's work. The markets are expecting it. We've staked the future of this company on it." "My father's work," Julian repeated, his voice dropping, cutting through the noise, "was built on a lie. And I will not allow that lie to be the future of this company." He projected the documents onto the large screen at the end of the room. The internal memos. The falsified inspection reports. The fire marshals ignored warning. A collective gasp went through the room. The board members stared at the screen, their faces pale. Peterson's smug expression dissolved into one of pure, unadulterated fury. "This is corporate suicide," one of the older members sputtered. "You'll ruin us. You'll ruin the Vance name." "The Vance name is already ruined," Julian countered, his gaze locking onto Peterson. "It was ruined the day we decided that our profit margins were more important than the lives of our workers. It was ruined the day we paid a grieving widow a pittance to buy her silence." "These are baseless accusations," Peterson snarled, rising from his chair. "You have no proof I was involved." "Don't I?" Julian said coldly. He projected another set of documents, bank statements, offshore account transfers, all detailing the money Peterson had siphoned from the insurance payout. The private investigator had been thorough. The proof was undeniable. The room fell into a stunned silence. Peterson stared at the screen, his face ashen. His career, his reputation, his entire carefully constructed life was unraveling before his eyes. "I am holding a press conference this afternoon," Julian announced to the silent room. "I will be revealing everything. I will be taking full responsibility as CEO for the actions of this company, past and present. Furthermore, I am dissolving my personal trust fund to create a new compensation fund for the families of every victim of the Sector 7 fire. It will be substantial." He was met with looks of utter disbelief. He was voluntarily giving up his fortune, his position, everything. It was a move so far outside the realm of their understanding that they could only stare at him as if he had lost his mind. "You're a fool, Vance," Peterson whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "You're destroying a legacy for what? A guilty conscience?" "No," Julian said, his eyes clear and resolved. "I'm not destroying it. I'm redeeming it. It's the first decision I've made as CEO that my father would have despised. And it's the first one I've ever been proud of." He turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the ruins of his old life behind him without a single glance back. Before the press conference, there was one more thing he had to do. He drove to Elena's apartment, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was the hardest part. He had to tell her the truth before the rest of the world heard it. He had to face her, knowing that what he was about to say could shatter the fragile trust they had built. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he saw the question in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. "Julian? What is it?" "You look. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She led him to the small sofa. He sat, but he couldn't get comfortable. He felt like a fraud in her home, a wolf who had been masquerading in sheep's clothing. He took a deep breath. "Elena, there's something I have to tell you. About the fire. About your husband." He told her everything. He laid the truth out between them, ugly and unvarnished. He told her about the cover-up, about Peterson, about his father's signature. He told her his name, Vance, was the name of the company that had failed her, that had taken her husband from her. He braced himself for her anger, for her hatred, for the moment she would tell him to get out of her life forever. She listened in absolute silence, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of shock. When he finished, the silence in the room was deafening. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the floor, waiting for the verdict. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "All this time," she said, more to herself than to him, "I knew something was wrong. I never knew what." She looked at him then, and he forced himself to meet her gaze. He saw not hatred, but a deep, profound sadness. And something else. Understanding. "This wasn't you," she said softly. "This was your father. This was that other man. It's not who you are." Julian was stunned. "But I'm the CEO, Elena." I'm responsible now. My name is on the building. I lied to you by not telling you sooner. You're telling me now, she countered, her voice gaining strength. You're making it right. That's what matters. The man I met at the park, the man who danced with my daughter, the man sitting in front of me right now. He is not the man who did this. She reached out and placed her hand on his. Her touch was a small, warm anchor in the storm of his guilt. You still have your integrity, Julian. You're proving it right now. Her absolution was a gift he did not deserve, a moment of grace that broke through his carefully constructed walls. Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time since he was a boy, he let them fall. He did not weep for the fortune he was about to lose, or the company he was about to dismantle. He wept for the years he had spent living a lie, and for the sheer, undeserved kindness of the woman sitting beside him. She didn't pull her hand away. She just sat with him, offering a quiet, unwavering support that was worth more than any empire. The press conference was a spectacle. The room was blinding with camera flashes and filled with the clamor of reporters shouting questions. Julian walked to the podium, feeling strangely calm. Elena had offered to come, but he had told her to stay home, to protect her and Mia from the ensuing media storm. Knowing she was there in spirit was enough. He stood before the world and laid his company's soul bare. He confessed to the negligence, the cover-up, the years of corporate deceit. He did not mince words or hide behind legal jargon. He spoke in plain, direct terms, accepting full and complete responsibility. He announced the dissolution of his personal fortune to create the compensation fund, detailing how it would provide not just money, but lifelong support, healthcare, and educational trusts for every affected family. Then, he did something no one expected. He spoke of Marco, not as a statistic, but as a man. He spoke of his heroism, of the family he had left behind. He did not name them, but his voice cracked with an emotion that was raw and undeniably real. He concluded by announcing his immediate resignation as CEO of Vance Industries. He laid down his legacy, his inheritance, and his name, and walked away from the podium without taking a single question. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The stock plummeted. The board was thrown into chaos. Peterson was arrested within the hour. The news cycles were dominated by the story of the billionaire CEO who had voluntarily destroyed his own empire in the name of truth. Some called him a fool, others a madman, but a surprising number of people called him a hero. He drove back to his penthouse, the place that had been his gilded cage for so long. It felt different now, no longer a prison, but simply an empty space he was passing through. He packed a single bag. As he was about to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was a photo of Mia's drawing, the three stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Below it, a simple message from Elena. We're proud of you. Come home. Home. The word resonated in his soul. He looked around the vast, empty penthouse one last time, then turned and walked out the door, leaving the keys on the table for the lawyers to collect. He was no longer Julian Vance, CEO. He was just Julian. And for the first time in his life, he was going home. The resolution was a quiet victory, not a triumphant one. The families received their compensation. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and dramas. Julian and Elena faced the aftermath together, their bond forged in the crucible of the crisis. There were tears, moments of quiet relief, and a mutual recognition of the long journey they had taken in such a short time. Their shared victory was not in the headlines or the courtrooms. It was in the small, peaceful moments they now shared, building a new life from the ashes of the old one. 1 year later, the city air was crisp with the promise of autumn. The sterile glass tower of Vance Industries was a distant memory for Julian. He no longer wore tailored suits or fielded calls from anxious board members. Today, he wore a simple pair of jeans and a work shirt, his hands smudged with dirt from planting a new maple tree. He stood in the center of a brand-new playground, part of the newly opened Marco Rivera Community Center. The center, the first project of the foundation he now ran, was a vibrant hub of activity in Elena's old neighborhood. It offered after-school programs, a free health clinic, and job training services. It was built not with corporate profits, but with the entirety of his former fortune. His new office was a small, cramped room in the back, and he had never felt richer. Elena came to stand beside him, handing him a bottle of water. They were a unit now, partners in life and in work. She had finished her nursing degree and now ran the community clinic, her quiet compassion a healing force for the entire neighborhood. They had sold his penthouse and her small apartment, moving into a modest but comfortable house a few blocks away, a home filled with laughter, the smell of Elena's cooking, and Mia's crayon drawings on the walls. "It's beautiful, Julian," Elena said, her eyes sweeping over the playground, where children were laughing and shouting. "You would have loved this." "I hope so," Julian said quietly. He looked at the bronze plaque near the entrance, in memory of the brave firefighters of Sector 7. "Your courage lights our way." Mia came running toward them, her face flushed with excitement. She was a year older, a year more confident, but her eyes held the same soulful wisdom. She held a small, handcrafted medal made of painted cardboard and ribbon. "This is for you," she said, standing on her tiptoes to place the ribbon around Julian's neck. On the medal, she had written in glitter glue, "World's Best Dad." Julian knelt, his eyes level with hers. The simple, profound declaration hit him with the same force as her first whispered request in the park a year ago. "Thank you, Mia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the best award I've ever received." "You're my dad now," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Mom said we're a chosen family. That means we picked each other." Julian looked up at Elena, who was smiling through her tears. He stood up, pulling Mia into a hug with one arm and wrapping the other around Elena, drawing them together into a tight circle. "Yes, we did," he whispered, his face buried in Mia's hair. "We absolutely did." Later that evening, the dedication ceremony was over, and the three of them walked back to their new home, hand in hand. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet streets. It was a simple moment, unremarkable to anyone watching, but to Julian, it was everything. It was peace. It was belonging. It was a future he never knew he wanted. Back at the house, while Elena tucked Mia into bed, Julian stood by the window, looking out at the small garden they were planting together. He gently touched the cardboard medal that still hung around his neck. He thought of the man he used to be, the lonely executive in the glass tower, a man burdened by a legacy he resented and a wealth that brought him no joy. It felt like a lifetime ago, like a story about someone else. Elena came and stood beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Are you happy, Julian?" she asked softly. He turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had seen him at his worst and had chosen to believe in his best. He saw his past, his present, and his future reflected there. He no longer saw the cascading numbers of the stock market. He saw love, trust, and a quiet, unshakable strength. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," he said. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss filled with the unspoken gratitude of a man who had been saved. He had lost an empire, a fortune, and a name. But he had gained a home. He had gained a family. He had gained himself. They stood together by the window, two people from different worlds who had found in each other a place to finally belong, building their family, one day, one quiet moment at a time.